On January 17, 1781, a 26-year-old British officer named Banastre Tarleton rode toward a quiet cattle pasture in the frozen backcountry of South Carolina. Behind him marched over 1,000 of the finest, most disciplined soldiers in the British Empire. Ahead of him sat a ragged, starving force of American rebels. Half of them were untrained militia, farmers and shopkeepers who had a reputation for dropping their weapons and running the second they saw a wall of British bayonets. Tarleton expected a quick slaughter. He expected to ride in, crush the rebels in under 30 minutes, and ride out a hero. What he actually rode into was the most perfectly executed tactical death trap in military history. In less than 60 minutes, Tarleton's elite force would be completely annihilated. Over 80% of his men would be killed, wounded, or captured. And the man who designed this masterpiece, a backwoods general with zero formal military education, would deliver a tactical masterclass so brilliant that officers still study it at West Point today. So how did a group of part-time soldiers and local farmers manage to shatter a professional British army in under an hour? How did a man who could barely afford shoes trick the most feared cavalry commander in the colonies into destroying his own career? To understand this tactical miracle, you have to look at South Carolina in late 1780. Because before the trap at Cowpens was ever sprung, the American Revolution in the South was on the absolute brink of total collapse. The British had already captured Charleston, taking over 5,000 Continental soldiers prisoner in the worst American defeat of the entire war. British General Lord Cornwallis was rolling through the southern countryside unchecked. Loyalist militias were burning homes, executing rebels, and terrorizing families. By every reasonable assessment, the war was over. George Washington sent General Nathanael Greene down to save what was left of the Southern Army. But when Greene arrived, he didn't find an army. He found 1,400 starving, barefoot men with barely any ammunition left. Greene needed a miracle. And to get it, he made a decision that every traditional military manual called pure insanity. General Nathanael Greene knew that if he fought the British in a standard, head-on battle, his tiny army would be wiped out in a single afternoon. The math was impossible. So, Greene did the last thing the British expected. He split his weak, starving force in two. He took half the men east to forage for supplies, and he sent 600 troops west into the wilderness under the command of Brigadier General Daniel Morgan. In traditional 18th century warfare, splitting your force when you are already outnumbered is military suicide. If Lord Cornwallis caught either group alone, the American Revolution in the South would be finished forever. But Greene trusted Morgan. Because Daniel Morgan was not a typical general. Morgan had no rich family, no aristocratic background, and no formal military schooling. He grew up dirt poor in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, working as a wagon driver, hauling supplies through the brutal frontier. He was big, rough, and fierce. During the French and Indian War, years earlier, Morgan punched a British officer in the face after being insulted. The British court martialed him and sentenced him to 500 lashes with a heavy whip, a punishment that killed most men. Morgan survived it. The whip tore his back to shreds, leaving deep scars he carried for the rest of his life. Morgan used to joke that the British drummer miscounted the strikes, so the king still owed him one last lash. That was the kind of man Daniel Morgan was. He did not forgive, and he definitely did not forget. When the Revolutionary War broke out, Morgan raised a company of Virginia riflemen and threw himself into the toughest fights of the northern campaigns. At the Siege of Quebec, he took a musket ball straight through his cheek and neck, lost teeth, but kept fighting. At Saratoga, his frontier sharpshooters picked off British officers from the tree line, helping force an entire British army to surrender. By late 1780, Morgan carried a deep, burning hatred for the British military. But more importantly, he possessed something far more valuable than any textbook military education. Daniel Morgan understood human psychology. He understood exactly how ordinary men behaved when bullets started flying and bayonets started flashing. He knew what made men fight, and he knew what made men run. And that honest, brutal understanding of human fear was about to become the core foundation of the deadliest trap of the entire war. When Morgan learned that Cornwallis had dispatched his most ruthless cavalry commander, Banastre Tarleton, to hunt him down and wipe him out, Morgan didn't panic. He saw his chance. He wasn't going to run away. He was going to pick the ground, set the bait, and let Tarleton's own arrogance destroy him. To understand why the trap at Cowpens worked so cleanly, you have to understand the biggest problem facing the American army: the militia. Militias were not professional soldiers. They were local farmers, shopkeepers, and blacksmiths who showed up with their own hunting muskets. They had no formal drill training, no uniforms, and most importantly, they had no bayonets. In the 18th century, the ultimate weapon on the battlefield was the bayonet charge. A line of disciplined British regulars would march forward, lock their steel blades at eye level, and charge with a terrifying scream. For an untrained farmer holding an empty musket, standing your ground against a wall of charging steel was almost impossible. Most Continental officers hated the militia. They called them cowards because time after time, at battles like Camden, the militia panicked, dropped their weapons, and ran away in minutes the second the British charged. But Daniel Morgan looked at the militia differently. Morgan didn't expect them to be something they were not. He knew they weren't cowards. They were just ordinary men with families who didn't want to get stabbed to death for free. Asking a local farmer to stand in an open field and trade musket fire with elite British regulars was like asking a high school team to line up against professional athletes. It wasn't a fair fight. Morgan realized that trying to force the militia to fight like European regulars was stupid. Instead, he decided to use their natural instinct to run as the ultimate secret weapon. The night before the battle, January 16, 1781, Morgan did something almost no other general in history ever did. He didn't stay hidden in a warm tent. He walked out into the freezing cold night and visited his men from campfire to campfire. He sat down in the dirt with shivering groups of militia. He cracked jokes, told stories about his days as a wagon driver, and showed them the deep whip scars on his back. Then he calmly laid out his plan. He didn't ask them to stand and fight to the death. He promised them they wouldn't have to face a bayonet charge. All he asked for was 2 good shots. "Just give me 2 good fires, boys," Morgan told them, looking them straight in the eyes. "Fire twice at 50 yards, then turn around, walk away with honor, and let the regulars finish the job." The men couldn't believe it. Morgan was giving them permission to leave the field. By dawn, every single farmer on that pasture knew exactly what his job was, exactly when to fire, and exactly where to run. Morgan had taken the militia's greatest weakness, their tendency to run under pressure, and turned it into the precise trigger of his trap. When morning came, Daniel Morgan brought his men to a place called the Cowpens. It was an open cattle pasture in northern South Carolina, surrounded by rolling hills and small patches of trees. When Morgan's officers looked at the location, they were horrified. To any trained military officer, Cowpens looked like the worst possible place to make a stand. Just 5 miles behind the American lines sat the Broad River, a wide, deep, freezing river that completely cut off any route of escape. In front of them stretched wide open pasture with no heavy woods to hide in, no swamps to slow down enemy horses, and no dirt walls for protection. If the British smashed through their lines, the Americans would have nowhere to run. They would be pinned against the freezing river and slaughtered. Morgan's officers begged him to find better ground. But Morgan had chosen Cowpens for that exact reason. He put the river at their backs on purpose. Morgan knew that if his militia had an easy escape route, they might run too early before firing their shots. By placing a deep river behind them, he removed the choice entirely. He told his men plainly, "Fight or drown." There was no middle ground. Now picture the battleground from above. Morgan arranged his force into 3 distinct, carefully calculated lines, spread roughly 150 yards apart along a gentle slope. The first line was out in front. It consisted of about 150 frontier sharpshooters from Georgia and the Carolinas. These were woodsmen carrying long rifles who could hit a target at 200 yards. Morgan gave them one simple job: target the British officers. Look for the silver epaulets on their shoulders, shoot the men on horseback, create chaos, fire a few shots, and then fall back to the second line. The second line was the main militia force, about 300 men under Andrew Pickens. This was the heart of the psychological trap. Morgan ordered them to wait until the British got within 50 yards, fire 2 direct volleys straight into the redcoat ranks, turn left, and walk calmly around behind the main army to reform. The third line sat on a low hill behind the militia. These were 450 veteran Continental regulars and tough Virginia state troops under Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard. These were disciplined, hardened soldiers who knew how to stand in a wall of smoke and trade bayonet charges with anyone. They were the anvil. And hidden completely out of sight behind a second low hill sat the hammer. Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, a cousin of George Washington, waited silently with 80 elite Continental heavy cavalry dragoon horses and 40 mounted militia riders. The trap was fully set. 3 lines of defense, a river blocking the rear, sharpshooters out front, and heavy cavalry hidden behind the hill. Every man knew his role. Every man was waiting. All Morgan needed now was for Banastre Tarleton to charge blindly into the center of the kill zone. And Tarleton was about to give him everything he wanted. To understand why Banastre Tarleton rode straight into Daniel Morgan's trap, you have to understand the mind of the man himself. Tarleton was just 26 years old, wildly arrogant, and famously aggressive. He commanded the British Legion, a fast-moving force of green-jacketed cavalry and light infantry that was feared across the entire American South. The year before, at a place called Waxhaws, Tarleton's cavalry had cut down surrendering American soldiers after they had already dropped their weapons. The colonists called him Bloody Tarleton, or the Butcher. He didn't care about caution or patience. Tarleton believed in 3 things: speed, brutal violence, and the cold steel of a bayonet charge. In every previous encounter with American militia, Tarleton had watched them crumble and run. He truly believed the colonists were cowards who could never stand against real British soldiers. For days, Tarleton had been chasing Morgan through the freezing South Carolina backcountry. He pushed his men at a punishing pace. On the night of January 16th, Tarleton roused his troops at 2 o'clock in the morning. He forced them to march through pitch-black darkness across swollen, freezing creeks and knee-deep mud. By the time first light broke on January 17th, Tarleton's men had been marching for over 6 hours. They were cold, exhausted, hungry, and hadn't slept. Horses were stumbling, and redcoats were dragging their feet through frozen dirt. When Tarleton's scouts reported that Morgan's army was lined up in an open field at Cowpens with a river trapped behind them, Tarleton smiled. From his perspective, it looked like a dream come true. The rebels were cornered. They had nowhere to run. Tarleton saw exactly what Morgan wanted him to see: a weak, trapped enemy waiting to be slaughtered. A cautious commander would have paused, let his tired men rest and eat, and properly scouted the hills. But Tarleton's arrogance blinded him completely. He didn't want to wait. He was terrified that if he paused for even an hour, Morgan might find a way to slip across the river and escape. Without holding back a strong reserve force, without checking behind the hills, and without letting his men eat breakfast, Tarleton ordered an immediate, full-scale attack. He formed his infantry into a long line, drew his cavalry sabres, and sent his exhausted troops surging forward across the frozen pasture. He thought he was marching toward a quick, easy glory. In reality, he was marching his men directly into the mouth of a waiting furnace. As the British line advanced across the frozen grass, the first thing they hit was Morgan's front line of sharpshooters. Rifle cracks echoed across the pasture. Frontier marksmen picked off British officers right out of their saddles. A captain dropped, then a sergeant. The sharpshooters fired, reloaded, fired again, and then slowly melted back into the second line, exactly as planned. Tarleton pushed his infantry forward. Up ahead, he could see the main militia line, rough-looking men in civilian coats holding muskets. The drums beat the charge. The redcoats leveled their bayonets and charged uphill with a roar. At 50 yards, Andrew Pickens gave the order. The militia line erupted in fire. 300 muskets blasted at point-blank range. The volley hit the British line like a physical wall. Entire rows of redcoats crumpled into the frozen mud. Smoke rolled across the field in a thick grey cloud. With shaking hands, the militia reloaded, poured a second crushing volley into the staggered British ranks, and then turned to their left. They began walking off the field, circling behind the main Continental line. And this was the moment Tarleton made his fatal mistake. When the British saw the militia turning and moving away, they thought the Americans were breaking. They thought it was Camden all over again. British officers screamed for the pursuit. A rush of adrenaline hit the redcoats, and their disciplined line dissolved into a chaotic, full-speed sprint uphill to finish off the fleeing enemy. They crested the low-rise, cheering and screaming, and ran directly into John Eager Howard's line of Continental regulars. 400 fresh, rested, disciplined soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder with muskets loaded and aimed. Howard waited until the British mob was just 30 yards away, then gave the command. A wall of lead tore through the disorganized British charge. Dozens of men dropped instantly. Before the survivors could process what had happened, Howard ordered a bayonet charge right into the stunned redcoats. At that exact second, the hidden hammer struck. William Washington's heavy cavalry thundered out from behind the second hill. 80 dragoon horses at full gallop smashed straight into the British right flank, sabres swinging, cutting down infantry from behind. And then the final trapdoor snapped shut. Andrew Pickens' militia, who had walked off the field minutes earlier, reappeared on the opposite side of the pasture. They reformed their line, loaded their muskets, and advanced on the British left flank. The British were hit from the front by Howard's bayonets, from the right by Washington's cavalry, and from the left by the returning militia. A total double envelopment, a complete encirclement executed by local farmers against an elite British army. The British force didn't just lose, it shattered. Redcoats threw down their muskets and threw up their hands. Tarleton tried to lead a desperate cavalry countercharge, but William Washington met him head-on in a swirling melee of horses, pistols, and sabres. The two commanders actually fought hand-to-hand on horseback before Tarleton broke away and galloped off the field with a handful of survivors. In under 60 minutes, Morgan killed or wounded over 300 British soldiers and captured nearly 600 more. Tarleton lost 80% of his entire force. Morgan lost just 12 men dead. The Battle of Cowpens was over in less than an hour, but its ripple effects destroyed the entire British strategy in North America. When Lord Cornwallis received the news that Banastre Tarleton's elite force had been annihilated, he was so furious that he reportedly snapped his sword in two. In a single morning, Cornwallis had lost a quarter of his entire army and his most aggressive cavalry commander. Desperate for revenge, Cornwallis made a fatal mistake. He ordered his army to burn their own heavy supply wagons, tents, and excess gear so they could move faster to chase Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan north into Virginia. That frantic chase exhausted the remaining British troops, stretched their supply lines to the breaking point, and pulled Cornwallis further and further away from his coastal bases. It was a pursuit born out of pure frustration rather than strategy, and it led Cornwallis directly into a small tobacco port on the Chesapeake Bay called Yorktown. 10 months later, surrounded by combined American and French forces by land and sea, Cornwallis was forced to surrender his entire army. The British force that laid down its arms at Yorktown was the same army that had been unraveling ever since Daniel Morgan set his trap at Cowpens. Military historians still compare Daniel Morgan's masterpiece at Cowpens to Hannibal's famous double envelopment of the Roman army at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC. But Hannibal pulled off his victory with seasoned veteran Carthaginian warriors who had trained together for years. Daniel Morgan executed his double envelopment with local farmers, shopkeepers, and militiamen who had been working cornfields just weeks earlier. Morgan took the biggest weakness of his army, the fear and unreliability of raw militia, and turned it into the centerpiece of a deadly trap. He used their retreat as bait, tricked an arrogant enemy into charging blindly, and changed the course of world history in under 60 minutes. Today, the pasture at Cowpens is a quiet national battlefield park in South Carolina. But over 200 years ago, on a freezing January morning, a backwoods general with no formal education proved that free people fighting for their homes could outsmart and outfight the greatest military empire on Earth. If you learned something new today, make sure to hit that like button and